Marry a stranger, or your mother's treatment ends tonight. The words landed like a gavel. A storm pushed rain against the windows at St. Vincent Medical Center. Fluorescent lights hummed. Outside the ICU, a family in designer coats closed ranks around one young woman in a thrift store dress. The groom was not late. The groom was unconscious. Sign Aunt Ruth Bennett said, voice low and precise. The engagement contract stands. The wedding proceeds. The Ashford name will not face scandal. Through the glass machines kept time for Lucas Ashford, 32, heir to a fortune, a man once photographed on magazine covers, now pale and still after a highway crash. Grace Miller, 23, felt the pen bite her fingers. I don't even know him. Her mother's cough echoed in memory. The clinic's last notice sat in her bag. Dollars and hours are running out. A lawyer slid a folder across cold plastic. A simple ceremony in the hospital chapel, a temporary arrangement, nothing more. Grace looked at the man on the bed. Tubes. Tape. A life paused. She opened her palm and touched the only thing she still trusted, a small brass locket that had been her mother's. Then she signed. Ink on paper. A vow spoken into the hum of machines. What happens when a life built on consent is replaced by a contract signed under a storm? Grace Miller lived in a 400-square-foot walk-up on the edge of town, one flight up, no elevator. In January, the draft crept under the door like a visitor who never left. The space smelled faintly of laundry soap and instant coffee, a single hot plate, a dented fridge that hummed loud after midnight. On the wall, a cheap clock that always ran 2 minutes slow. Most mornings began before dawn. Grace took the 5:20 bus to the grocery store on Maple Avenue where she worked the express lane. 10 items or fewer. She wore a name tag with a clip that snagged her sweater and left little snags like scars. She smiled until her cheeks ached. She bagged bread on top and canned beans below. She asked, paper or plastic, because the script kept her moving. On good days, someone said, thank you, honey. On hard days, someone tossed a card and said nothing at all. From noon to 4, she sat at her mother's bedside in their apartment. The small bedroom smelled like menthol and lemon cleaner, pill bottles lined up by size, a cheap plastic pill sorter marked with the days of the week. The clinic had called the cough complicated. Grace tracked the hours between doses, the ounces of water left in the glass, and the number on the thermometer. She wrote everything down on index cards because writing made fear hold still. When the cough racked her mother's ribs, Grace pressed a warm towel to her back and whispered, in through the nose, out through the mouth. I am right here. In the early evening, she took a second shift 2 nights a week as a home health aide, the kind of job that paid by the hour and forgot your name by Tuesday. She learned how to lift without straining her back. She learned the patience it takes to loop a button into a stiff shirt cuff. She learned how to make a grilled cheese so soft it did not scratch a sore throat. The locket lived against her collarbone. Brass thumbprint small with a hinge that clicked in a way you could hear only in a quiet room. Inside was a photo no larger than a postage stamp. Her mother at 22, hair tucked back, holding a baby with a serious brow and a fist in the air like a declaration. On the opposite side, a scrap of paper faded to light brown. 3 words in her mother's careful hand. Keep your promise. Grace did not need to read them to know what they said. She had memorized the shape of each letter. Rent was $875 a month. Bus fare was $2.50 each way. Milk ran $3 and change unless you bought the store brand. The clinic's copay for one visit was $40, which felt like an ocean. Grace counted every bill twice. She rolled coins into paper sleeves like a kid saving for a bike. She wrote due dates on sticky notes and lined them along the edge of the mirror. She wanted art school once. She sketched in the margins of receipts when the express lane slowed. Faces, hands, the way eyes soften when someone mentions a grandchild. The notebook stayed in her bag, elastic looped tight, because keeping it close felt like keeping herself close. When she had 10 spare minutes, she drew her mother's hands at rest the blue map of veins under thin skin. On Sundays, if the buses ran on time, she copied faces from the newspaper and tried to catch the posture of people who thought no one was watching. Grace did not complain much. She believed in small tasks done well. She believed in folding a blanket square, in rinsing a mug even when she was late, in calling the clinic back even when the voice on the line did not know how to recognize worry. At night she fell asleep to the radiator's clank and the city's low tires on asphalt hush. When the cough woke her mother at 2 a.m., Grace woke too. She kept the thermometer and the vapor rub on a tray within reach like a soldier keeps a kit ready. On the morning the family called her to St. Vincent, the wind cut sharp about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, with a bite that found the space between scarf and skin. Grace wore the thrift dress under her winter coat tights with a mended run and shoes she had polished with a paper towel and a dab of dish soap. She pressed the lock at once before she stepped into the storm. "Keep your promise," she said out loud to no one. Then she walked fast toward the bus stop, because buses in bad weather do not wait. At the ICU door under light that made everything pale, the world shifted. A folder, a pen, words like engagement contract, family reputation, and coverage withdrawn arrived like stones in a sack. Grace felt the weight and did not break. She sighed, because the locket was warm against her skin. She signed because a mother's breath is a kind of clock you do not gamble with. She signed because sometimes survival is the only tool still in your hand. When the brief ceremony ended and the room returned to its hum, Grace pulled a chair to the side of Lucas Ashford's bed. She placed the locket on the blanket for a moment, as if to introduce two lives that had no right to meet. "I will sit with you until you wake up," she said. Someone should. Then she counted his breaths the way she had counted her mother's steady even like a metronome that insisted on hope. Ashford Holdings owned more than buildings. It owned views. From the top floors of its riverfront tower, the city spread out like a map a person could fold and refold at will. Glass walls met walnut panels. The carpet swallowed footsteps. Framed photos showed handshakes with governors and ribbon cuttings where the scissors gleamed brighter than the smiles. In that world, Aunt Ruth Bennett was gravity. She did not raise her voice. She adjusted a cuff and people moved. Her pearls were the color of winter light. Her pen left a fine blue line across contracts that changed other people's lives. She spoke in numbers and outcomes and never in maybes. When she entered a room, men in suits found reasons to agree with her twice. The Ashford family ran meetings in a boardroom the size of a chapel, a table of polished oak, a row of leather chairs that remembered everyone who sat in them. At the head hung a portrait of the company's founder. In it, a stern man stared down as if the present were a test the living might fail. A screen at the far end carried graphs that looked like mountains on clear days and like cliffs when the quarter went bad. Miles Harrington, head of public relations, kept his tie a shade too perfect, and his words even more so. He had a vocabulary built for fires he did not intend to put out. Optics, narrative, positioning. He measured crises by the hour and billed them by the minute. In his view, mercy played well if you kept it off camera. Empathy was a line item that paid for itself only when the timing was right. Andrew Fletcher, estate counsel, returned with new files and old warnings. He spoke in clauses and footnotes. He quoted sections. He never said no. He said it would be unwise. He drafted agreements that made doors look open while the hinges were welded shut. If a life needed tidying, He tidied it with a signature and called the mess resolved. The Ashford mansion sat behind tall gates on a lawn that did not admit footprints. A Georgian facade, stone steps that gleamed after rain, inside chandeliers threw light like coins. In the dining room, a table ran the length of a small apartment. The china was as thin as a whisper. A butler stood with the stillness of a statue until a hand moved, and then he was somehow everywhere at once. In these rooms, the family told itself a story. The story said the Ashford name carried responsibility, which meant obligation to investors, charities, and headlines. The story said that marriages were mergers unless proven otherwise. It said that sorrow could be scheduled between the end of the luncheon and the start of the call with Tokyo. It said that appearances were not surface. They were structure. Ruth repeated that story in careful sentences. Lucas would wake to the company intact. The board would be steady. The press would be offered clean frames. The hospital ceremony rushed, and private had been a brace on a broken limb. Necessary, yes. Permanent, no. She spoke this aloud as if the words could dry the ink on a future already chosen. Cousin Victoria Ashford floated through those rooms like a fragrance that did not fade. Silk dresses, hard eyes. She collected phrases the way she collected invitations. Poor girl. Stand in. She said them softly enough to pass as concern. She set them down in other people's ears and walked away before the echo reached her. When Grace crossed the threshold for the first time wearing borrowed heels and a thrifted dress pressed smooth with the bottom of a warm pan, the house itself judged her. The runner did not creak under her weight. The crystal did not clink for her water glass. The oil portraits did not nod. Staff looked past her as they had been trained to do, not cruelly, efficiently, the skill of polite erasure. At dinner, the talk was stocks and seasons, wine pairings, a museum gala the following week. Ruth asked nothing about the bus schedule Grace kept in her head or the pill sorter labeled with days. Victoria asked about the ring, not the hand that wore it. Miles offered phrases for later use. Our family appreciates her devotion. The estate continues to respect privacy. Andrew set a document beside Grace's plate and tapped the place for her initials. Across town, in a 400-square-foot walk-up, survival meant rent on time and milk not spoiled. In the mansion, survival meant never letting the room see you sweat. The contrast held like a spotlight. It made Grace smaller in their eyes. It made her clearer in ours. In the tower the next morning, the board convened without Lucas for the first time in months. Ruth took the chair. She did not mention the makeshift vows under stained glass or the way the nurse had dimmed the ICU lights so the priest could speak. She mentioned debt covenants. She mentioned market confidence. She mentioned a path forward that left no room for a girl who signed to save her mother. Standing at the edge of that world, Grace felt the shape of the wall she was up against. It was not one person. It was a system with good posture and excellent taste. It would not shout at her. It would smile and suggest better options. It would hand her a pen and call surrender a choice. The invitation arrived on a thick cream card. Dinner at the Ashford estate. Formal, 7 o'clock. Grace read it twice on the bus, the paper too heavy for a life that counted quarters for laundry. She pressed her mother's brass locket once and told herself it was only an evening. A room, a table, air in, air out. The mansion glowed like daylight held indoors. A butler took her coat without meeting her eyes. Crystal chimed. A quartet turned pages with quiet hands. At the long dining table, place cards waited. Ruth at the head. Victoria to her right. A chair for Grace far down near the flowers as if distance could make her smaller. Mrs. Ashford Miles said smoothly as she sat trying the title on her like a jacket he planned to take back later. The press will be reassured to see you here. I did not come for the press, Grace answered. Her voice surprised even her. Steady. Low. Ruth's smile did not reach her eyes. You came because family shows unity when storms pass through. Storms pass when windows are opened, Grace said. Not when shades are drawn. Victoria lifted a crystal flute gaze, cool. How poetic. Did the grocery store teach you that darling knives flashed softly against porcelain? A server set down steak, the kind that is cut with a butter knife. Grace's borrowed heels pinched. She ate slowly because swallowing felt like work. Halfway through the main course, Fletcher approached with a leather folio. Acknowledgments for tonight's appearance, he said, laying papers beside her plate. Discretion clauses. Mileage reimbursement. I took the bus, Grace said. Then you will appreciate the reimbursement, he replied, unmoved. Ruth folded her napkin and leveled the room with one sentence. We will discuss an annulment when Lucas is medically stable. Quietly, kindly, you will be provided for. Your mother's care, of course, continues. The words were polished, professional, and cold as a new coin. Grace set down her fork. He is my husband, she said. In law. In fact, I sat beside his bed when no one else did. Victoria laughed. You sat beside a legacy. Do not confuse the two. The quartet paused between pieces. Silence laid a thin film over the table. Then a voice at the far end, high, startled. My bracelet. It was just here. Heads turned. A guest touched her wrist, pale where a sapphire tennis bracelet should have gleamed. Staff moved with trained calm. The butler checked under napkins. A server retraced steps. Miles murmured to Ruth. Ruth lifted a hand. The room held its breath. Fletcher's eyes found Grace's worn satchel near her chair. May we, he asked, already reaching. Grace drew the bag closer. Why? To clear the air, he said softly, for everyone's comfort. Victoria tilted her head a sympathetic shape that did not touch her mouth. No one is accusing. We are eliminating possibilities. Grace felt heat rise in her face. She could say no. She could stand and walk out into the night and never look back. But her mother's voice was in her ear. Keep your promise. She unbuckled the flap and set the bag on the table. The butler lifted out what a life like hers required. A bus pass, a small pill organizer with Tuesday missing, a pocket notebook with a looped elastic, a pencil worn to the size of a finger, a receipt for antibiotics, a folded scarf that still held a hint of her mother's perfume. No bracelet, no gleam of sapphire. Then, as the butler reached for the final item, something clicked tiny and unmistakable. The brass locket slipped from the pocket of the scarf and tapped the china once, not loud, but the sound traveled anyway. Fletcher's hand paused. Ruth's eyes sharpened. The locket lay in the open like a coin tossed on a table, brass worn to a soft shine. On its face, barely visible until the light caught it just right, an engraved crest, no larger than a fingernail, a shield, a laurel, 2 letters intertwined, A and H. No one spoke. Grace reached for it on instinct the way a person reaches for breath. Ruth's fingers were faster. She turned the locket under the chandelier, searching not as a guest, but as a custodian. Where did you get this? Ruth asked. The room narrowed to the size of the question. It is my mother's Grace said. She gave it to me when I was a child. Ruth pressed the tiny hinge. It stuck, then yielded with a soft give. Inside, a time-thinned photograph. A young woman with dark hair and a familiar tilt to her chin, holding a baby with a serious brow. On the opposite side, under the metal rim, a scrap of paper the color of tea, the ink faded, but legible. For E, keep this close. J. Ruth went still, the kind of stillness that is not absence, but impact. Victoria leaned in, impatient. Well, she said lightly, so the grocery girl owns an old trinket. Ruth's voice when it came was lower than before. "This is not a trinket." Miles adjusted his cufflinks. "We are off track." "The bracelet." A server appeared at the door, breathless with relief. "Found, ma'am." It slipped beneath the chair cushion. Laughter, nervous and thin, washed the edges of the table. Conversation lifted a little too bright, but the air did not clear. Ruth closed the locket with care and set it not back into Grace's palm, but beside her own plate near the water glass that never emptied. Grace drew a breath. "That belongs to me." Ruth did not look away. "It belongs to a story you do not yet know." The quartet began the next piece, but even the first sweet note could not stitch the room back together. The papers by Grace's plate fluttered in a small draft from the hall, as if something in the house itself had exhaled. At the far end of the table, under portraits that watched and said nothing, a door had opened. Not for an annulment, for a reckoning. Ruth did not blink. She held the locket as if it were warm despite the room's chill. Around the table, talk resumed in strained threads, but it was theater. The center of gravity had moved to a small brass oval, small enough to fit in a child's palm. "Come with me," Ruth said quietly. She rose. Grace followed through a side hall lined with portraits. Oil and gilt. The faces watched with old eyes. In a smaller sitting room, the door clicked shut behind them. A lamp cast a circle of yellow light over a low table. Rain ticked against a tall window. In that hush, the locket made a sound when Ruth set it down. A soft final note. "Open it again," Ruth said. Grace's fingers knew the hinge. The lid stuck, then gave. The thin photograph looked darker here, the young woman's hair glossy, her jaw familiar in a way that unsettled. The baby's brow was serious, fist raised like a promise. The paper scrap under the rim showed its ghost letters clearly in the lamplight. "For E. Keep this close." J. Ruth's voice dropped. "E is Eleanor, my sister. J is Jonathan, our father." Grace looked up, breath-catching. "Your sister." Ruth nodded once. This crest, she tapped the locket's face with a careful nail, was struck when the Ashford line married the Hart line. 2 letters, A and H, 2 families bound. Only a handful of these were made. One passed from my mother to Eleanor the year she turned 20. She paused, and for the first time her posture softened as if memory had weight. Eleanor disappeared from this house one winter. She was clever, romantic, and recklessly sure the world would be kind. When she returned months later, she carried a baby. No husband, no explanation our father would accept. Grace's hands tightened around the locket's edge. The baby. Ruth looked at the photograph as if it might rise and speak. "Your grandmother begged. Our father summoned a lawyer. An arrangement was made with a nurse who lived far from the riverfront. For the child's good," he said. "For the family's stability." Eleanor was sent overseas. She died a year later of pneumonia. I said those words for decades as if recitation could turn them into fate. She swallowed. I have never believed them. Grace felt the room tilt. The air in her chest turned thin. "My mother," she whispered. "Her name is June Miller." Ruth closed her eyes at the name, grief crossing her face without cosmetics to blur it. June. That was the nurse's chosen name for the baby. The month she came to her, we sent money, quietly. Papers called it a stipend for community support. It was penance folded into policy. Ruth opened her eyes. We told ourselves it was mercy. It was cowardice. Grace stared at the photograph until the woman's smile blurred. In the corner of the image, a bit of wallpaper showed a tiny pattern of blue leaves. In childhood, when her mother opened the locket, Grace had traced those leaves with a fingernail, inventing stories about a house she had never seen. She had never let herself ask why the baby's brow looked like her mother's. She had never asked why the hinge creaked in a way that made her mother close it quickly, as if memory itself were a draft that could chill a room. "How did the locket leave this house?" Grace asked, her words careful, as if speaking too fast might tear something. Ruth answered with the precision of a ledger long hidden. "Our father gave it to Eleanor. Eleanor left it with the baby the night she was carried away. The nurse kept it until June was old enough to understand that love can leave hard edges. Later, when money thinned and shame did not, June wore it under blouses that did not fit. She wrote one letter to this house. I saw it. Our father returned it unopened. I did not stop him." Rain thickened at the window, a steady white noise that made confession feel private. Then Ruth continued. Years passed. A marriage, perhaps. A change of names. We never looked. Or rather, she corrected herself, we never permitted ourselves to look. Grace closed the locket and set it down carefully, as if handing back a verdict. "So I am family," Ruth said simply. "By blood. By history no press release can erase." Grace's throat tightened. "Lucas is my brother's son," Ruth said, "which makes you and Lucas cousins by a tangle of lines our father would have redrawn if he could. He is recovering enough to stand in a boardroom. He does not know this truth. Few do." Silence landed heavy and full. Grace found a chair with the back of her calf and sat before her knees failed her. "And the way I came into this house," she said softly, "the chapel, the contract, the conditions tied to my mother's care, did you know Ruth did not pretend? I consented to the arrangement because I believed it would stabilize a story spiraling toward ruin. I believed a quiet annulment would tidy what grief and weather could not. I did not know that Lockett would return and set fire to my clean lines." Grace let out a sound that was not quite a laugh. It had no humor, only breath. "I thought I married a stranger to save my mother. I walked into a storm, and all along the storm had our names in it." Ruth's shoulders dropped a small surrender. "I was raised to keep the house standing, whatever the cost. I learned to turn sorrow into philanthropy and secrets into policies. I did not learn how to hold a child my father would not name. I am tired of that ignorance." She reached for the locket and after a beat slid it back across the table. "This belongs on your neck, not because it proves worth, because it tells the truth." Grace's fingers closed over the brass. The metal felt warmer now, as if the past carried heat. She thought of her mother's cough, the pill sorter with Tuesday missing the rent due on the 1st, and the bus fare she always counted twice. She thought of Lucas asleep under a tangle of tubes, the rise and fall that had made her count breaths the way she counted change. "What will you do?" Grace asked, her voice small and steady with the truth. Ruth folded her hands, a gesture that throughout the years had signaled decisions finalized, budgets set, and signatures completed. It looked different now. "I will say it aloud, to Lucas, to the board, to anyone who asks. Our father's choices will not bind us, but the telling will break things. Glass, alliances. I do not know yet which." Grace's eyes stung. She had wanted safety, not upheaval. She had wanted an answer that paid a bill and did not ask for a soul. Instead, the truth had opened a door and a cliff in the same motion. Ruth's voice gentled an ease Grace had not heard in it before. "You may walk away, Grace. I will arrange your mother's care regardless. You owe us nothing for the harm we renamed as help." Grace looked down at the locket and then up at the portrait over the fireplace. A stern man with eyes like closed doors. She met his tainted gaze without flinching. "I do not owe you," she said, "but I owe myself. And my mother. I will not be erased." When they returned to the dining room, conversation dipped and rose around them like a tide, trying to forget a storm. Victoria's glance sharpened, then slid away, wary for the first time. Miles checked his phone. Fletcher stacked papers neatly, as if control were a stackable commodity. Ruth resumed her chair, but the room had changed shape. Gravity had shifted. Grace touched the locket at her throat. The hinge clicked once, a small sound swallowed by crystal and silver. In that instant, she understood the cost of a name and the price of a secret. She also understood that the next steps would be made in light, not shadow. The next morning broke clear and cold, mid-40s Fahrenheit. The kind of air that makes your breath show. Grace stood at the hospital window and watched a delivery truck back to the dock. She pressed the locket once, then turned to Lucas. Machines whispered. Sunlight cut a thin bar across his blanket. A soft knock. Aunt Ruth stepped in with a banker's box. Not leather, not gilt, just cardboard and tape. Behind her came a woman in her 70s coat buttoned to the throat, hands, neat eyes bright. Grace Ruth said, voice even. This is Mrs. Evelyn Harper. She worked here years ago. She was the nurse who carried an infant out of this house when the winter was cruel. Mrs. Harper set her purse on the chair, palms flat on top. I kept a copy of what I wrote, she said. I thought nobody would ever ask. Ruth lifted the lid. Inside lay a small spiral notebook, a stack of letters tied with kitchen twine, and a worn envelope stamped with a postmark from 30 years back. On the front, in tidy script, for Ruth when you are brave. Ruth touched the envelope as if it might lift on its own. Eleanor's hand, she whispered. She did not open it. Not yet. Mrs. Harper cleared her throat. Your grandmother brought the baby with a blanket and a locket. She said the child's name would be June. I made a note. Names matter when paper is thin. She opened the spiral to a page yellowed at the edges. January 14th, snow heavy. Infant female, healthy, mother pale, father absent. Gifted a brass locket with crests A and H. Note tucked inside. For E, keep this close. J. Grace met the nurse's eyes. You kept this all this time. Mrs. Harper nodded. Truth has a way of waiting. I did not want it lost. Ruth took one letter from the stack and offered it to Grace. Read it aloud, she asked softly. If you can. Grace slid the paper free. The fold gave with a little sigh. The ink had faded, but the words held. Dear Ruth, if this reaches you, it means I chose courage late. I wanted love to be simple. I wanted a door to open when I knocked. I brought a child into a house that could not hold her. I am leaving for a while because Father says it is best. You know what he means by that. Keep the crest. Keep the name. But keep your kindness more. One day a girl will come looking. If she wears this locket, listen to her before you listen to the room. The paper shook in Grace's hands. She read the last line again slower, letting each word find its place in the air. Listen to her before you listen to the room. Behind them, something changed. Not the machine's pitch, not the sunlight. A breath, deeper, held, released. Lucas Grace whispered. His right hand moved under the sheet. Not a twitch this time. A search. Grace took it with both of hers, careful of the IV, careful of hope. His eyelids fluttered once. Opened, closed, opened again. His gaze caught the light, blurred, then steadied. He saw Ruth first, then the nurse, then Grace. He tried to speak. Only a dry sound came. Grace reached for the water and a small sponge on a stick the nurse had shown her how to use. Moisten first, she murmured, and dabbed his lips, her hands not shaking until it was done. Where he managed. St. Vincent, Ruth said. You've been sleeping. It's time to listen. His eyes moved to the locket at Grace's throat. His brow drew the faintest line. Yours. Grace nodded. It was my mother's. It was Eleanor's. Your aunt's sister. She kept her voice slow with rests because people waking sometimes lose words if you rush them. I married you in a storm I did not choose. I signed because my mother was running out of time. I stayed because you were alone. I'm telling you now because truth does not wait for perfect rooms." He watched her mouth, as if reading there what his body could not yet hold. "Family," he said. A question without a question mark. Ruth moved closer. "Grace is Eleanor's granddaughter, your first cousin once removed. It is complicated. It is human. We will put it all in order, but not before we tell the truth out loud." He shut his eyes once a long blink that looked like a man taking stock. When he opened them, he found Mrs. Harper. She stood straighter under his gaze. "I was there," she said gently. "I carried the baby. Your grandfather called it mercy. It was fear. We can call it by its name now." Lucas pulled in a breath that sounded less like work. "Bored," he said, voice still raw. "Press." "Ruth, later," she answered. "First listen." She passed Grace the remaining letters. "They are not all Eleanor's," Ruth said. "Some are mine. Some are from a lawyer I once trusted too much. Some are from a donor who warned me about optics while a child's life unfolded 6 miles away." Grace set the stack on the tray table. "Then let us put them in order," she said. "For him, for my mother, for you." She reached into the box again and found one more envelope with a return address that made her breath hitch. June Miller, Maple Avenue, inside a single sheet. Grace knew the paper. She had taken it from the pad by the phone. "If this reaches you, it means I did not want my daughter to meet her blood through gossip. I wore your crest under blouses from the thrift shop and told myself names do not warm rooms. But when the cough kept me up, I pressed that locket and thought, maybe it is time. If a woman named Ruth reads this, listen before you explain. If a boy named Lucas reads it, be kind to the girl who wears it." June Ruth bowed her head. "She did write," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. "I did not answer. I will carry that." Lucas swallowed. "You will fix what you can," he said. "Not a question. A charge." Ruth met his eyes. "I will." A knock. Then the door opened wider and the room filled with what the family used when they felt cornered. Miles with a statement, Fletcher with forms, and Victoria with a camera-ready frown. Security hovered behind them, a soft wall. "We need to control the narrative," Miles began, already in motion. "A brief to reassure markets. A photo op for human interest. The marriage was a kindness in a crisis. We pivot to charity. We reframe. No, Ruth said. Miles blinked. "I beg your pardon." "No pivot," Ruth said. "No framing. We are done staging weather. We are going to tell the sky it is blue." Victoria's gaze slid to the locket. "This again," she said. "We are dragging fables into rooms that run on numbers." Ruth's tone did not rise. Numbers paid for silence. Letters kept the truth. Evelyn kept a record. Eleanor kept faith with a handful of words. June kept her child and her dignity with almost nothing but her hands. She looked at Fletcher. "You will draw up a statement confessing the arrangement and our intent to seek guidance on what it means for Grace and Lucas. You will guarantee continued medical support for June Miller as long as she draws breath. You will prepare to open our archives." Fletcher opened his mouth, then closed it. "Very well," he said. He removed his glasses and cleaned them on a handkerchief, as if clarity were a ritual. Miles attempted one last turn. "If we go public with bloodlines and secrets, we invite lawsuits." Ruth nodded. "Then we will face them. Better a hard truth than a soft lie." Victoria laughed once, a short sound. "You will burn the house down." Ruth stepped closer until the space between them was less than a foot. "Our father built rooms so polished they reflected only him," she said. "I will open a window." The air changed, not by degrees, on purpose. Grace looked at Lucas. "If you want me to go," she said, "steady, say it. I will not hold you to vows made by machines." He stared at the ceiling for a long breath, as if choosing the shape of the rest of his life. Then he turned back to her. "Do not go." He said the words rough, but clear. "I do not know what we are. I know who was here." Tears stung her eyes. She did not touch her face. She squeezed his hand once gently as if signaling across a river. Ruth lifted Eleanor's unopened letter again, then set it on Lucas's chest. "When you are stronger," she said, "read it first. Then the board. Then the press. In that order." Mrs. Harper buttoned her coat. "I will swear to my notes," she said. "A record is a kind of witness." "Thank you," Grace told her, and meant all the words those two simple ones hold. The room emptied in steps. Miles left with his playbook under his arm and no place to run it. Fletcher carried his forms like a man who finally understood. Paper can be a door, not a wall. Victoria paused at the threshold, looked back at the locket, and for the first time said nothing at all. When the door clicked shut, quiet settled. Outside, the sun cleared a thin bank of cloud and laid a warmer band across the blanket. Lucas watched the light. "Tell me again," he said from the beginning. Grace did. Not the boardroom version. The bus stop. The pill sorter was missing Tuesday. The way machines hum at 2 a.m., the sound a locket makes when it taps china. She spoke in short lines with room for breath. Ruth stood at the window and listened like a woman learning a new language after years of speaking only in statements. When Grace finished, no one clapped and no one smoothed a press release. Ruth reached for Grace and, awkward for a moment, pulled her into an embrace that said, "What policy never will." "I am sorry. I am here. I will not look away again." Grace stood very still and let herself be held. The locket warmed between them. By week's end, the city knew more than headlines. It knew names. Eleanor, June, Grace. It knew a locket had crossed a lifetime to speak. Cameras waited on the sidewalk outside St. Vincent. The air held its breath. Midday sun on cold glass, footsteps, questions, no answers yet. Inside the room was quiet. Lucas sat up longer each day. The color had returned to his face, not all at once, but like dawn. Grace read the last of the letters at his bedside. She did not dramatize them. She let each line land, then rest. Aunt Ruth listened from a chair by the window, hands folded shoulders, lower than anyone had ever seen them. Mrs. Evelyn Harper returned once more. She swore to her notes. She hugged Grace with both arms, solid and brief, like a nurse who knew how to give strength without taking it back. Then she left the room walking straighter than when she arrived. The board called. The press called. Lawyers wrote drafts and rewrote them. Ruth said, "We will answer." Not today. First family. She looked at the portrait of the founder in the hallway and did not look away. She had spent a career protecting the house. Now she was opening the front door. At dusk, Grace wheeled her mother into the corridor, a blanket across her knees. The cough is lighter than before. Lucas watched them with a look no contract can order. Grace's mother reached for his hand. "Thank you for listening," she said. He nodded because sometimes the right word is a quiet one. On the small table sat two envelopes. One held a draft annulment already signed by counsel, waiting only for names. The other held a simple card handwritten by Lucas. "If we choose this, we choose it awake. No pressure, no debt. Your name first, then mine." The locket warmed against Grace's skin. Freedom is not silence, she thought. It is voice, it is time, it is the right to walk toward or away. Night gathered at the window. The monitors hummed. In a few hours, the house on the river would light its chandeliers for a press statement. Between now and then, a decision waited. Not about optics, about a life. If you were Grace, what would you choose? Walk away with the truth and your dignity intact, or stand and build something new on ground that finally has a name.